Step back. A waitress has no business here. Dr. Harrison Webb's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Behind him, a billionaire lay dying, his face turning from purple to gray as a chunk of steak sealed his airway. The Heimlich had failed. Twice. 3 times. Nothing worked. Aaliyah Brooks stood her ground, her hands steady despite the rage building in her chest. I know another technique. My grandmother taught me. It works when the obstruction is deeper. Webb laughed coldly. Folk remedies? This man is worth $4 billion. Get her out of here. Security moved toward her. The crowd watched with hungry eyes. She's delusional, someone whispered. A waitress playing doctor, another sneered. But Aaliyah had already made her choice. What happened next would go viral within hours, sparking a war between modern medicine and ancestral knowledge that no one saw coming. Subscribe now, because this story is far from over. Aaliyah Brooks had worked at the Meridian for 3 years, long enough to know that invisible was the safest way to be. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, where a single appetizer cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that stretched 20 feet high. The silverware was actual silver. The clientele were the kind of people who appeared on magazine covers and spoke in numbers with too many zeros to comprehend. And Aaliyah moved among them like a ghost. At 26, she had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. She refilled water glasses before they emptied, cleared plates before crumbs accumulated, and smiled just enough to seem pleasant, but not enough to invite conversation. The wealthy guests rarely looked at her face. To them, she was simply an extension of the furniture, a mechanism that delivered food and disappeared. Tonight was no different. The dinner rush had brought in the usual crowd of hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and their trophy companions. Aaliyah worked her section with practiced efficiency, her mind half on the tables and half on the anatomy textbook waiting in her locker downstairs. She was 3 semesters into her nursing degree at City College, attending classes after her shifts ended at 11. Most nights, she studied until 2 in the morning, slept for 4 hours, then started again. Her grandmother would have been proud. Grandma Efua had raised Aaliyah in a cramped apartment in Atlanta after her mother disappeared into addiction and her father became a name she never learned. Efua had been a community health worker in Ghana before immigrating to America, and she carried her knowledge across the ocean like precious cargo. In neighborhoods where hospitals were distant and insurance was a fantasy, Efua became the person people called when someone was sick, injured, or dying. She taught Aaliyah everything. How to recognize the signs of a stroke. How to stop bleeding with pressure and elevation. How to help a choking infant when there was no time to wait for an ambulance. The lessons came wrapped in stories of the Ashanti people, of generations who survived without modern medicine by understanding the body's natural mechanisms. The ancestors knew things, Efua would say, her accent thick with the rhythms of her homeland. They watched, they learned, they passed it down. Modern doctors think they invented healing, but healing existed long before their fancy machines. Efua died when Aaliyah was 19, leaving behind a collection of handwritten notebooks and a granddaughter determined to honor her legacy by becoming a nurse. 7 years later, Aaliyah was still working toward that dream, one expensive semester at a time. Tonight, she pushed thoughts of her grandmother aside and focused on the task at hand. Table 14 needed their check. Table 12 wanted another bottle of the $200 Cabernet. And Table 9, the large corner booth reserved for VIPs, was occupied by a man whose face she recognized from the business section of every major newspaper. Richard Hale. Even among the wealthy patrons of the Meridian, Hale stood apart. His net worth reportedly exceeded $4 billion, built on a real estate empire that stretched from Manhattan to Miami to Los Angeles. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, and carried himself with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no. Tonight, he sat with two business associates, their conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed performative rather than genuine. Aaliyah had served him before. He was not cruel like some of the guests, who treated staff with open contempt. But he was not kind either. He simply did not see her. His eyes passed over her face. Without registering her existence, his orders delivered to the air rather than to a person. She did not take it personally. Invisibility, after all, was her specialty. The evening proceeded normally until approximately 8:47. Aaliyah was clearing dishes from table 12 when she heard the first sound. A wet, strangled gasp that cut through the ambient noise of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. She turned toward the sound instinctively, her training from countless first aid courses triggering an automatic response. At table 9, Richard Hale was clutching his throat. His face had turned a deep, alarming shade of red. His eyes bulged with terror as he tried to draw breath and failed. The two men across from him sat frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized what was happening. Hale was choking. Someone screamed. The sound broke the spell of shock that had momentarily paralyzed the room. Guests at nearby tables scrambled backward, chairs scraping against the marble floor. A woman in a red dress pressed her hand to her mouth. A man in a gray suit fumbled for his phone. Then a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "I'm a doctor. Everyone move back." A tall man in his 60s pushed through the gathering crowd. Aaliyah recognized him as Dr. Harrison Webb, a cardiologist who dined at the Meridian regularly. He was a hospital chief of some kind, the type of physician who appeared on morning talk shows to discuss heart health. His face was calm and authoritative as he positioned himself behind Richard Hale. "Sir, I'm going to perform the Heimlich maneuver. Try to stay calm." Webb wrapped his arms around Hale's midsection, positioned his fist just above the navel, and thrust upward with practiced precision. Nothing happened. He thrust again, and again. Each time, Hale's body jerked with the force, but the obstruction remained lodged in his airway. His face was transitioning from red to a deep, bruised purple. Another man stepped forward, identifying himself as an orthopedic surgeon visiting from Boston. He and Webb exchanged places, and the second doctor tried his own variation of the technique. Sharper thrusts, different positioning, the same result, nothing. Aaliyah watched from 10 feet away, her hands still holding the dirty dishes she had been clearing. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had seen choking victims before. She had practiced the Heimlich on mannequins dozens of times in her first aid courses. She knew the technique was effective in most cases, but she also knew that most was not all. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as the day she had first heard it. Aaliyah had been 12 years old, watching Ifua demonstrate on a pillow positioned against a chair. "The Heimlich works when the object is here," Ifua had said, pointing to a spot high in the throat. "But sometimes the thing gets stuck deeper, lower. The thrust cannot reach it. When that happens, you must use gravity. You must help the body do what it wants to do naturally." The technique Ifua taught her was different. It involved tilting the victim forward, using gravity to encourage the obstruction to move toward the mouth rather than deeper into the lungs. Combined with sharp blows to the back at a specific angle, it created a different kind of force. Not the upward thrust of the Heimlich, but a vibration that traveled through the airways and loosened objects that were wedged too deeply for conventional methods. Aaliyah had never used it on a real person. She had practiced on dummies and pillows and once on her cousin, who volunteered to pretend he was choking. But she had never faced a genuine emergency. Until now. Richard Hale's face was turning gray. The purple was fading into something worse, something that looked like death approaching. "Doctor, Webb was still trying the Heimlich, his movements growing more desperate, his composure cracking. The orthopedic surgeon had stepped back, shaking his head. Someone shouted that an ambulance was on the way. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Aaliyah knew that was too long. The brain began to die after 4 minutes without oxygen. Even if paramedics arrived in time to save his life, Richard Hale could suffer permanent damage. He could lose the ability to speak, to think, to recognize his own family. She set down the dishes. Her hands were trembling. Her throat was dry. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should stay back, stay invisible, let the doctors handle it. She was a waitress. She had no medical degree. If she intervened and something went wrong, she could be sued. She could be arrested. She could lose her job and her chance at finishing nursing school. But if she did nothing, a man would die. She moved forward. Marcus, the restaurant manager, intercepted her before she reached the table. He was a thin man in his 40s with a permanent expression of anxiety, and right now that anxiety had escalated to full-blown panic. "Aaliyah, what are you doing? Get back to your station." "I can help him," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, steady despite the terror churning in her stomach. "I know another technique." Marcus grabbed her arm. "Are you insane? We have 2 doctors here. You're a waitress." "Do you have any idea what kind of liability?" "He's dying." She pulled free from his grip. "Look at him. The Heimlich isn't working. I know something else that might." Dr. Webb heard her. He turned, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. "Young lady, step back immediately. This is a medical emergency. Whatever folk remedy you think you know is not going to help." "It's not a folk remedy," Aaliyah said, still moving forward. "It's a technique for when the obstruction is too deep for abdominal thrusts. Gravity positioning combined with percussive strikes to the back. It creates a different kind of force. That's not a certified technique." Webb's voice was sharp with condescension. "I've been practicing medicine for 35 years. I think I know what I'm doing." A woman near the edge of the crowd let out a bitter laugh. Aaliyah did not need to look at her face to understand the meaning behind that sound. A waitress. A black waitress, specifically, trying to tell 2 white doctors how to save a life. The absurdity of it was written in the expressions of half the people watching, but Aaliyah was no longer looking at them. She was looking at Richard Hale. His movements had slowed. The frantic clawing at his throat had weakened to feeble twitches. His eyes were losing focus, the light in them dimming like a bulb running out of power. He had maybe 90 seconds left, perhaps less. Aaliyah turned to Marcus. Her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear. "If I don't do this, he dies right here on your floor. That's what the news will show tomorrow. A billionaire dead at the Meridian, while 2 doctors failed to save him. I'm willing to take the blame if I'm wrong. Are you willing to live with it if you stop me?" Marcus stared at her. His mouth opened, then closed. He did not move. Aaliyah pushed past him. She knelt beside Richard Hale, who had slumped sideways in his chair. Up close, the grayness of his skin was even more terrifying. She could see the veins standing out on his temples, the sweat soaking through his expensive shirt, the terror frozen on his features. "Mr. Hale." She kept her voice calm, the way Grandma Efua had taught her. Panic was contagious. Calm was too. "I'm going to try something different. I need you to trust me." He could not respond. He could barely see her. But something in his eyes flickered, a last spark of awareness reaching toward her voice. Dr. Webb moved toward them. "I'm warning you, if you interfere with a medical situation and cause harm, then sue me." Aaliyah did not look at him. She was already positioning her hands, already calculating angles and force. "But do it after I save his life." She gripped Richard Hale's shoulder and began to move him into position. The technique required precision, not strength. Grandma Afua had repeated that lesson countless times during their practice sessions in the small Atlanta apartment. Power without accuracy was useless. The body had its own mechanisms for expelling foreign objects. The job of a healer was not to overpower those mechanisms, but to assist them. Aaliyah pulled Richard Hale forward from his slumped position. He was heavy, easily 200 pounds, and his muscles had gone slack from oxygen deprivation. She braced her knee against the chair and used her body as a counterweight, tilting him until his torso angled sharply downward. His head hung toward the floor at approximately 60 degrees. "What are you doing?" Dr. Webb demanded. "You'll cause aspiration." Aaliyah ignored him. She positioned her left hand on Hale's shoulder to stabilize him, then raised her right hand with the heel of her palm facing outward. The target area was the space between his shoulder blades, slightly off-center toward the spine. The angle of the strike needed to be upward and inward, directing force toward the airway rather than simply impacting the back. She inhaled deeply. Grandma Afua's voice filled her mind, calm and instructional. "Feel the body. Trust what you know." The first strike landed with a solid thump. Hale's body jerked, but no sound emerged from his throat. No cough, no gasp, nothing. Aaliyah adjusted her position slightly and struck again. The second blow was harder, more precise. Still nothing. The crowd around her had gone silent. She could feel their eyes burning into her back, feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The third strike. Her palm connected with his back, and she felt a faint vibration travel through his ribcage. A tiny wheeze escaped his lips. Something was shifting, but not enough. "It's not working," someone said. The voice dripped with vindication. "I told you this was ridiculous." Aaliyah blocked out the noise. She thought about her grandmother's hands, weathered and strong, demonstrating this same technique on a cushion propped against a kitchen chair. She thought about the stories Afua told of village healers in Ghana who saved lives with nothing but knowledge passed down through generations. She thought about all the times she had doubted whether that knowledge was real or just folklore dressed up as medicine. She raised her hand for the fourth strike. This time, she focused not just on the force, but on the feedback. She let her palm rest against Hale's back for a split second before striking, feeling for the subtle vibration that would tell her where the obstruction sat. Her grandmother had called it listening with your hands. Western medicine would have called it impossible. The fourth blow landed. Hale's body convulsed. A wet, gurgling sound bubbled up from his throat. Close, so close, but the obstruction remained lodged. Aaliyah had one more chance. If the fifth strike failed, she would have to step back and let the paramedics take over. By then, the damage to Hale's brain might already be irreversible. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, everything seemed clearer, sharper. She could see the exact spot where her palm needed to land, could feel the angle that would create the perfect resonance through his airways. The fifth strike was different. It was not harder than the others, but it was more precise. Her palm connected with the exact point between his shoulder blades, angled 15 degrees upward and to the left. The force traveled through muscle and bone and into the chest cavity, creating a wave of vibration that rippled through his trachea. A chunk of meat flew from Richard Hale's mouth. It landed on the marble floor with a wet slap, pink and glistening under the chandelier light. For a moment, no one moved. The restaurant existed in a state of suspended animation, every guest frozen in place like figures in a photograph. Then Richard Hale gasped. The sound was ragged and desperate, the most beautiful noise Aaliyah had ever heard. Air rushed into his lungs with a rattling wheeze. Color began to return to his face, the deathly gray giving way to flushed pink. He coughed violently, his body expelling the trauma of the past 2 minutes, and sucked in another breath. He was alive. The silence shattered. Voices erupted from every direction. Someone was crying. Someone else was laughing in disbelief. A woman clutched her companion's arm and repeated, "Oh my God," over and over like a prayer. "Doctor." Webb stood motionless, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked almost like anger. Aaliyah remained kneeling beside Hale, her hand still resting on his back. Her own breathing was ragged. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. She had done it. The technique that her grandmother had taught her in a cramped apartment in Atlanta, passed down from generations of Ashanti healers, had just saved a billionaire's life in the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. Paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. By then, Richard Hale was sitting upright, breathing on his own, surrounded by a protective circle of restaurant staff. The EMTs checked his vital signs, administered oxygen, and prepared to transport him to Mount Sinai for observation. Through it all, Hale's eyes kept drifting toward Aaliyah, who had retreated to the edge of the crowd. She could not read his expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or confusion, or something else entirely. Before she could interpret it, the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher and wheeled him toward the service elevator. The chaos began to subside. Guests returned to their tables or headed for the exit, buzzing with the kind of excitement that only a brush with death could generate. Marcus appeared at Aaliyah's elbow, his face pale and his voice strained. "My office, now." She followed him through the kitchen and down a narrow hallway to a windowless room barely larger than a closet. Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a migraine. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Aaliyah stood with her hands clasped in front of her, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I saved his life. You performed an uncertified medical procedure on a guest worth $4 billion, in front of witnesses, in front of doctors who explicitly told you to stop." Marcus shook his head. "I should fire you on the spot." "Then fire me." The words came out sharper than she intended. 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of being overlooked and undervalued, and now she was supposed to apologize for saving a man's life. The unfairness of it burned in her chest like acid. Marcus stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Go home," he finally said. "I need to talk to legal. Don't come back until I call you." Aaliyah left the restaurant through the service entrance, emerging into the freezing December night. The cold air hit her face like a slap, and suddenly the adrenaline that had sustained her began to drain away. Her legs felt weak, her hands trembled. She leaned against the brick wall of the alley and tried to breathe. She had done the right thing. She knew that with absolute certainty. But as she stood alone in the darkness, she could not shake the feeling that the right thing was about to cost her everything. By morning, the video had gone viral. Someone in the restaurant had filmed the entire incident on their phone. The footage was shaky and poorly lit, but it captured everything. Richard Hale turning gray. Dr. Webb's failed attempts at the Heimlich. Aaliyah pushing through the crowd, kneeling beside the dying man, tilting him forward and striking his back with methodical precision, the chunk of meat flying from his mouth. The collective gasp of the crowd. The video appeared first on TikTok, where it accumulated 3 million views in under 6 hours. From there, it spread to Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. News outlets picked it up by noon. By evening, Aaliyah's face was plastered across every major network. The headlines varied in their framing. Some celebrated her as a hero. Black Waitress saves billionaire's life after doctors fail. Others were more skeptical. Unverified folk technique used in life-threatening emergency. A few were openly hostile. Dangerous amateur intervention could have killed choking victim. The comment sections were worse. Aaliyah scrolled through them on her phone, sitting in the tiny apartment she shared with 2 roommates in Washington Heights. She knew she should stop reading. Every therapist and self-help article in existence warned against engaging with online negativity. But she could not look away. She's a hero. We need more people like her. Lucky shot. That could have easily gone wrong. Why didn't she let the doctors handle it? Who does she think she is? This is what happens when people think Google is better than medical school. Another black woman being praised for almost killing a white man. Classic. Folk medicine is pseudoscience. This video should be removed for spreading misinformation. The comments blurred together, a cacophony of praise and condemnation that made her head spin. Some people called her brave. Others called her reckless. A disturbing number focused on her race, either celebrating her as a symbol of black excellence or attacking her as an uppity waitress who did not know her place. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for City College's nursing department. Aaliyah answered with a knot forming in her stomach. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Simmons, the department chair. Her tone was careful, measured, the kind of professional neutrality that usually preceded bad news. Ms. Brooks, I'm sure you're aware that your situation has attracted significant attention. The college has received numerous inquiries from media outlets. Some of our faculty have expressed concerns about the nature of the technique you employed. Aaliyah gripped the phone tighter. It's a legitimate method. It's based on the same principles as the back blows recommended by the Red Cross. Be that as it may, Dr. Simmons interrupted. The optics are problematic. You're a nursing student who publicly performed an uncertified procedure. Some people are calling it folk medicine. Others are calling it worse. There was a long exhale on the other end of the line. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, Ms. Brooks. I'm saying that perception matters in this field. I wanted to make you aware that there may be complications with your enrollment going forward. The line went dead. Aaliyah sat motionless, staring at the phone in her hand. 3 semesters of nursing school, thousands of dollars in tuition, countless hours of studying after exhausting shifts at the restaurant, all of it suddenly at risk because she had dared to save a man's life with knowledge that did not come from a textbook. Her grandmother's face rose in her memory, lined with age but bright with conviction. Efua had spent her entire life being dismissed by the medical establishment, being told that her knowledge was superstition and her methods were primitive. She had watched people die from treatable conditions because doctors in fancy hospitals refused to listen to a woman with an accent and no degree. And now Aaliyah was facing the same walls, the same dismissal, the same invisible barriers that separated legitimate from illegitimate, professional from amateur, worthy from worthless. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw her phone against the wall and watch it shatter into 1,000 pieces. But she did neither. She sat in the silence of her small apartment and waited for the next blow to fall. It came the following afternoon. Marcus called to inform her that she was suspended pending review. The restaurant's legal team was assessing potential liability. Several guests had complained about the disturbance. Dr. Harrison Webb had reportedly contacted the restaurant to express his displeasure at being undermined by a member of the service staff. Aaliyah listened to it all without responding. When Marcus finished, she thanked him for the call and hung up. She was 26 years old, alone in a city of 8 million people, watching her dreams crumble because she had chosen to act instead of staying invisible. Every authority figure in her life was lining up to punish her for the same decision. The doctors, the restaurant, her nursing school, the faceless masses on social media. All of them agreed on one fundamental point. She had stepped out of her place, and now she would pay the price. That night, she dreamed of her grandmother. Efua stood in a field of tall grass, her gray hair blowing in a wind that Aaliyah could not feel. She did not speak, but her eyes carried a message that needed no words. Keep going. Do not let them bury what I gave you. Aaliyah woke up crying. The call came 3 days later. Aaliyah was sitting in her apartment staring at a nursing textbook she could no longer concentrate on when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Unknown numbers usually meant reporters or trolls who had somehow obtained her contact information, but something made her answer. "Ms. Brooks?" The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. "Please hold for Mr. Hale." Before she could respond, there was a click, and then a different voice came on the line. This one she recognized, though she had never heard it speak directly to her. It was deeper than she expected, with a faint accent she could not quite place. "Ms. Brooks, this is Richard Hale." Aaliyah's mouth went dry. "Mr. Hale, how are you feeling?" "Alive," he said. The word carried a weight that surprised her. "Thanks to you." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. "I've been watching the coverage," Hale continued. "I've seen what they're saying about you. The restaurant, the nursing school. That pompous cardiologist who couldn't save a man's life but has plenty of opinions about those who can." His voice hardened. "I want you to know that I've already contacted the Meridian. If they fire you, I will personally ensure that every media outlet in the country knows that they terminated the woman who saved my life. I suspect their reservation list would suffer considerably." Aaliyah felt something loosen in her chest. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." There was a rustling sound, as if he was shifting in a hospital bed. "I also gave an interview this morning. It should air tonight on the evening news. I told them exactly what happened. That 2 doctors tried the standard technique and failed. That you stepped in with something different. That you saved my life when everyone else had given up." She blinked back tears she had not realized were forming. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Hale was silent for a long moment. "Because I watched the video," he finally said. "I watched you push through that crowd. I watched the way people looked at you, like you were nothing, like you had no right to even try." His voice dropped. "I know what that feels like, to be dismissed before you even open your mouth." Aaliyah absorbed his words in silence. "I want to meet with you," Hale continued. "When I'm out of the hospital, I want to understand where that technique came from. I want to know about your grandmother, about the knowledge she passed down to you. And I want to discuss some ideas I have about making sure that knowledge doesn't disappear." "What kind of ideas?" "The kind that require a conversation in person." There was a hint of a smile in his voice. "I'll have my assistant contact you with the details. In the meantime, try not to let the bastards get you down. You did something extraordinary, Ms. Brooks. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The line went dead. Aaliyah sat holding the phone, listening to the silence. Outside her window, the city churned with its usual indifferent energy. Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that a waitress in Washington Heights had just received a call that might change everything. She thought about her grandmother, about the notebooks filled with handwritten remedies and techniques, about the generations of knowledge that Efua had carried across an ocean and entrusted to her granddaughter. For the first time in days, Aaliyah allowed herself to hope. Richard Hale's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building he owned in the financial district. The view stretched across the Manhattan skyline, a panorama of glass and steel that represented more wealth than Aaliyah could comprehend. She stood by the window, watching the city pulse beneath her, and tried to steady her nerves. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the Meridian. Hale's public statement had shifted the narrative dramatically. The restaurant had quietly reinstated her, though Marcus could barely look her in the eye. City College had stopped making ominous phone calls about her enrollment. The tide of social media opinion had turned in her favor, at least for the moment, but Aaliyah knew how quickly tides could shift. Hale entered the office looking healthier than she expected. The grayness that had consumed his face in the restaurant was gone. replaced by the ruddy complexion of a man accustomed to expensive wines and Caribbean vacations. He moved with the same confident stride she remembered from the Meridian, though something in his eyes seemed different. Softer, perhaps. More present. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward a leather chair across from his desk. "I know this is unusual." Aaliyah sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "You said you wanted to discuss some ideas." Hale settled into his own chair and studied her for a moment before speaking. "I've spent the last 2 weeks thinking about what happened. Not just the choking, though that certainly focuses the mind. I've been thinking about what came after, the way people reacted to you, the way they dismissed what you did as luck or folk nonsense or something worse." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk. "I've also been doing research. The technique you used, the positioning and the strikes, it's not as unscientific as people want to believe. The principles are sound. Gravity-assisted positioning, percussive force to dislodge deep obstructions. The Red Cross recommends something similar for infants. But somewhere along the way, that knowledge got separated from its origins. It got sanitized and credentialed and stripped of its history." Aaliyah nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say that modern doctors think they invented healing. But healing existed long before their fancy machines." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." The words carried more weight than Aaliyah intended. "She died when I was 19. I've spent the last 7 years trying to honor what she taught me." Hale was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its boardroom polish. "I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone in over 4 decades." He turned toward the window, his profile sharp against the city skyline. "My name wasn't always Richard Hale. I was born Rashid Halabi in Beirut. My family immigrated here when I was 14, right after the Civil War started. We had nothing. Less than nothing. My father worked 3 jobs, my mother cleaned houses, and I learned very quickly that Rashid Halabi was not a name that opened doors in America." He turned back to face her. "So I changed it. Changed my name, my accent, everything that marked me as different. I buried Rashid so deep that sometimes I forgot he ever existed, and it worked. It got me into the right schools, the right rooms, the right deals. But it cost me something I didn't understand until I was lying on that restaurant floor, watching my life drain away." Aaliyah waited for him to continue. "I watched you in that video," Hale said. "I watched you push through that crowd, past those doctors, past everyone who was telling you to stand down. You carried your grandmother's knowledge with you, and you used it to save my life. You didn't hide where you came from. You didn't pretend to be something you're not." His voice grew rough. "I spent more than 4 decades running from my origins. You made me realize what I lost by running." The silence between them felt sacred, like something fragile that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly. "I want to create something," Hale finally said. "A foundation. A research initiative. Something that studies the medical knowledge preserved in immigrant communities and the African diaspora. Knowledge that's been dismissed as superstition, but might actually have scientific validity. I want to bridge the gap between ancestral wisdom and modern medicine." Aaliyah felt her heart rate increase. "What would that look like?" "I'm calling it the Hale Brooks Initiative for Ancestral Medicine, and I want you to be part of it. Not as a figurehead or a token, as a co-founder, as the community liaison who connects researchers with the people who actually hold this knowledge." The magnitude of the offer pressed against her chest. "Mr. Hale, I'm a waitress. I don't have credentials. I don't have a platform. People will say it's pseudoscience. People will say a lot of things." Hale's expression hardened with determination. "Let them. We'll have data. We'll have peer-reviewed research. We'll have results. That's how you change minds. Not by arguing, but by proving." Aaliyah thought about her grandmother's notebooks, still stored in a box under her bed. Pages filled with remedies and techniques and observations accumulated over decades. Knowledge that Afua had carried across an ocean, that her mother had carried before her, that stretched back through generations of women who healed their communities without degrees or licenses or recognition. "There's something else," Hale added. "NYU has a nursing program, one of the best in the country. I've already spoken with their admissions office. They're prepared to offer you a full scholarship, contingent on your participation in the initiative. You'd finish your degree while helping to build something that could change how medicine thinks about traditional knowledge." The offer hung in the air, glittering with possibility. But Aaliyah had learned to be cautious about glittering things. They often came with hidden costs. "What's the catch?" Hale smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his severe features. "No catch, just a condition. Before the initiative launches publicly, the medical community will want proof that what you did wasn't a fluke. They'll want you to present your technique to a review board. Explain the mechanics. Answer their questions. Demonstrate that it can be taught and replicated." Aaliyah's stomach tightened. "You want me to stand in front of a room full of doctors and defend something my grandmother taught me in her kitchen? I want you to show them that their kitchens don't have a monopoly on truth." The review board convened 6 weeks later in a conference room at Mount Sinai Hospital. Aaliyah arrived early, dressed in a simple navy blazer borrowed from one of her roommates, her grandmother's notebooks tucked under her arm. She had spent the intervening weeks preparing with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She read every study she could find on airway obstruction and first aid techniques. She practiced her presentation until she could deliver it in her sleep. She reached out to emergency medicine specialists who were willing to explain the physics of choking in terms that could be translated into medical jargon. The board consisted of 5 physicians. 4 of them were strangers, their faces neutral and unreadable behind the conference table. The 5th was Dr. Harrison Webb. He had not spoken to her since the night at the Meridian. Now he sat at the center of the table, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular coldness of a man whose professional pride had been wounded in public. Aaliyah understood that he was not here to evaluate her technique objectively. He was here to regain the authority that had been stripped from him when a waitress succeeded where he had failed. She took her position at the front of the room, set her notes on the podium, and began. "The technique I used on Mr. Hale is based on 2 established principles of emergency medicine. The first is gravity-assisted positioning, which encourages foreign objects to move toward the mouth rather than deeper into the airway. The second is percussive force applied to the upper back, which creates vibrations that can dislodge obstructions too deep for abdominal thrusts to reach." She walked them through the mechanics, using diagrams she had prepared and referencing studies from the European Resuscitation Council. She explained the angle of the strikes, the positioning of the body, the way her grandmother had taught her to feel for feedback through her palm. "This technique was developed in the Ashanti communities of Ghana," she continued, "generations before modern emergency medicine existed. It was passed down through oral tradition, refined through practice, and preserved by healers who had no access to hospitals or ambulances. My grandmother was one of those healers. She brought this knowledge to America, and she taught it to me." The questions came quickly, some curious and some hostile. A pulmonologist asked about the risk of causing additional obstruction through improper positioning. Aaliyah explained the angle adjustments that prevented this. An emergency medicine specialist asked how the technique could be standardized for training purposes. Aaliyah acknowledged that this was an area requiring further research. Then Dr. Webb spoke. "Ms. Brooks," his voice was cold and precise, "you've presented an interesting theory, but theory is not evidence. You performed this technique once in an uncontrolled environment on a patient who might have expelled the obstruction on his own given another few seconds. How can you claim that your intervention was the determining factor? Aaliyah met his eyes without flinching. I can't claim that with absolute certainty, but I can tell you what I observed. Mr. Hale's oxygen deprivation was severe. His movements had slowed. His eyes were losing focus. In my first aid training, I learned that brain damage begins after 4 minutes without oxygen. By my count, Mr. Hale was approaching that threshold when I intervened. Webb's expression did not change. Your first aid training. From a community college course, I presume. Not exactly the same as a medical degree. No, Aaliyah agreed. It's not. But the physics of choking don't require a medical degree to understand. Gravity pulls objects downward. Vibration loosens things that are stuck. These aren't theories I invented. They're principles that your own profession relies on. I'm simply pointing out that my grandmother's community figured them out through observation and practice, without the benefit of your fancy machines. The room went silent. Aaliyah could feel the tension crackling between her and Webb, could see the other board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She had not intended to be confrontational, but something about his dismissiveness had triggered a response she could not contain. Webb leaned forward. You're asking us to validate a technique that has never been subjected to clinical trials, to put our professional reputations behind what is essentially folklore dressed up in scientific language. Surely you understand why that's problematic. Aaliyah took a breath before responding. I understand that the medical establishment has a long history of dismissing knowledge that doesn't come with the right credentials attached. I understand that healers like my grandmother spent their lives being told that their experience didn't count because they didn't have degrees. And I understand that you feel embarrassed because a waitress saved a man's life when you couldn't. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere along the table. But I'm not asking you to validate folklore, Aaliyah continued. I'm asking you to study it, test it, subject it to the same rigorous analysis you'd apply to any other technique. If it doesn't work, the research will show that. But if it does work, you'll have a new tool for situations where standard methods fail. Isn't that worth investigating? The board deliberated for over an hour after her presentation ended. Aaliyah waited in a small anteroom, her knee bouncing with nervous energy, her grandmother's notebooks clutched against her chest like a talisman. When they finally called her back in, the lead physician, a silver-haired woman named Dr. Eleanor Price, delivered the verdict. Ms. Brooks, the board has decided not to certify your technique at this time. Aaliyah's heart sank. However, Dr. Price continued, we have agreed to recommend a formal research study to evaluate its efficacy. If the results are positive, we will revisit the question of certification and potential inclusion in first aid training protocols. It was not full vindication, but it was not dismissal either. It was a door cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. 6 months later, the study results were published in a peer-reviewed journal of emergency medicine. The findings showed that the combined technique, gravity-assisted positioning plus angled percussive strikes, achieved a 23% higher success rate than standard Heimlich maneuvers alone in cases involving deep airway obstructions. The researchers recommended further study and suggested that the technique might be valuable as a supplementary method in situations where conventional approaches failed. The Hale-Brooks Initiative launched officially the following month. Richard Hale stood at a podium in a ballroom filled with journalists and medical professionals, announcing a $10 million commitment to studying traditional healing practices from underrepresented communities. Aaliyah stood beside him, wearing a dress she had bought with her first paycheck as the initiative's community health liaison. She had completed her first year at NYU's nursing program with honors. Her grandmother's notebooks had been digitized and archived as part of the initiative's research collection. 3 other traditional techniques from the African diaspora were currently under investigation, including a fever reduction method and a wound care practice that showed promising antimicrobial properties. Dr. Harrison Webb did not attend the launch event, but a week later, Aaliyah received notice that he had quietly signed up to participate in the initiative's next research project. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had passed between them. Just a name on a volunteer list, suggesting that perhaps minds could change even when pride prevented words. On a crisp Saturday morning in early October, Aaliyah flew to Atlanta. She took a taxi from the airport to a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city, where the graves were marked with simple stones and the grass had begun to fade with the changing season. Her grandmother's plot sat beneath an old oak tree, the headstone weathered but legible. Afua Mensa Brooks, beloved mother and grandmother, healer. Aaliyah knelt in the grass and placed a copy of the medical journal article against the stone. The pages fluttered in the cool autumn breeze, but the weight of a small rock held them in place. "They're studying it now, Grandma," she said softly. "Your technique, the things you taught me, they're writing papers about it, teaching it to doctors." She smiled through the tears gathering in her eyes. "You always said the ancestors knew things. Now everyone else is starting to figure that out too." She stayed until the sun began to set, talking to the grandmother who had raised her, who had given her everything, who had trusted her to carry ancient knowledge into a world that did not want to believe in it. When she finally stood to leave, she looked back at the headstone one last time. "I kept it alive," she whispered, "just like you asked me to." The breeze stirred the pages of the journal article, and somewhere in the rustling leaves above, Aaliyah could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "Well done, child. Well done."